I guess, we had two problems with, the first iteration of DeFi. First iteration of DeFi breaks and it still remains within the circle of crypto for crypto users, for high net worth individual DeFi funds, etc. If we're able to get a DeFi that is safe, truly safe, right? And I'm talking about orders of magnitude, and that is sufficiently general to tackle all kinds of use cases, not just one specific risk profile or compliance profile, but any risk, any compliance profile. We're going to progressively reach mass adoption.
Welcome to the Protocol Podcast. I'm Brad Keoun here with my co-hosts Margaux, Nijkerk, and Sam Kessler. Excited to dive into today's show with the latest news and developments in technology behind crypto and blockchains. First, please do not forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Protocol, on CoinDesk.com. And let's dive right into it. We've got a pretty incredible guest today here, Paul Frambot. He's co-founder and CEO of Morpho Labs, a research and development company responsible for building and growing the Morpho protocol, which is, at the forefront of kind of this evolving and crazy, landscape of DeFi and sort of changes every week or month. And we're going to go deep with Paul a little bit later. But first, we're going to talk about ETH Denver, which actually all three of y'all were out there. Sam, Margaux, both moderating panels, and Paul was out there, just is now back in Paris. And Margaux, you had a pretty interesting panel. And you've also been writing about the Keoun upgrade on Ethereum, which is coming next week, which is pretty amazing just how fast this stuff unfolds. Of course, like everybody talking about Bitcoin all-time high this week is the dominant story, but, it's just like the news in crypto never sleeps. Margaux, tell us what were some of your experiences out at ETH Denver last week and some of the panels that you moderated?
Yeah, I mean, what was really noticeable to me is that the presence of like layer twos and like DA solutions and a lot of infrastructure layer solutions, they were all there. They were roaming the halls. And what I also noticed is that like the ETH core devs team was not really present. So I think that was like an interesting observation, just because like it was almost like they were competing and fighting for like marketing and users and things like that. And of course, like everyone was talking about what Keoun means, because it's like right around the corner, and layer twos are at the center of that. They're going to be benefiting the most from that because of proto-dank sharding, which will lessen like transaction fees eventually for users of layer twos, but primarily for like data availability for layer two. So that was really interesting to sort of see what their take was. I think like high level overall, all the teams sort of agreed that it's all speculative at this moment. Like we don't really know what that like change will look like post Keoun, but that I think there's going to be some kind of war, between these layer two teams for, who can deliver the best like price point in terms of, transacting on these layer twos and the cheapest price point, let's say. And they all had different takes. Like it all really depends on the economics of these layer twos in terms of like how much data they're willing to consume from a layer one or a layer two. So
obviously, last week we had Jesse Pollock on of Base, Coinbase's Base layer two, talking about kind of his breakdown of the fees and how those might shake out post Keoun. And Margaux actually has a really good story out today, talking to some of the other teams at Arbitrum and Polygon and Starkware. And that is on CoinDesk.com. So check that out. And Paul, I'm curious, what were some of your highlights or any surprises, anything that like you didn't know before, or it's anything that really kind of changed your views on things?
No, I think, look, that was my first test ever. It was the first time I went there, and I genuinely really loved it. Like the quality of the conversations I had there were extremely high. And I guess, the one narrative that I would, keep and that has emerged from this conference for me is The panel I gave is Uniswap and Maker about finance being moving from apps to infrastructure, and essentially how we're rebuilding finance like the internet, right? Instead of having like monolithic financial products on chain, we're more having like a layered sort of like structured approach. And I've been discussing a lot with like the Uniswap team, with the Maker team during the events, and a bunch of other teams as well. And everything seems to be converging in that direction. And that's also the case in like socials, when you think of it as like fast Kessler, when you see like how the protocol has been built and layered as well. I just feel like we're getting there, and we're truly rebuilding the internet and extending the internet by transferring data that is now valuable thanks to the properties of blockchain. It was the first time for me, like the 3 years that I'm working in this space, that I could feel concretely that we're deeply transforming the current state of the internet today, and not just building short-term ephemeral products. It's just like true deep infrastructure that will support like very like massive growth and adoption.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I guess if the concept is, a lot of people talk about, what blockchain is doing is kind of reinventing finance. But maybe if this is what you're saying, Paul, is just kind of thinking about it as the next iteration of internet development.
Yes, exactly. So the way we think about it is, in the early days, especially in the context of DeFi, like the first experiments were about building financial products on chain, right? How, in traditional finance, we have funds. Okay, how do we bring them in chain and make it decentralized with a smart contract, with a decentralized governance? And, this is what Compound innovated on, for example, by having, one big pool of capital where people can deposit, and then the fund gets managed, in a decentralized way. And forming very great financial products, but then, as soon as you want to scale and you want to add more assets or more features, well, you kind of have problems because you have to enshrine all the complexity in one financial product. And eventually, if you keep that route, well, most likely you're going to end up, taking too much risk, which happened in 2022 and 2023, essentially. And the new approach that we have now, and that's many protocols, actually most protocols are looking into, is doing much less to be able to enable more on top. And instead of building financial products, building financial rails, financial infrastructure, on top of which financial products can be built, right? And at the end of the day, this is how kind of the internet has been built around networking protocols. So if you think about SMTP or HTTP, those are like very unopinionated protocols that are global. They don't have any opinion about the web page that is contained in HTTP or the compliance or the regulations or anything. It's just like a very pure, simple, and scientific object on top of which you can, rebuild abstraction layers until you get to this very nice front-end web page on CoinDesk, for example, that completely abstracts away the internet protocol. And I think this is the same route for like DeFi, is like having extremely minimalistic, simple, and fundamental primitives on top of which you rebuild, maybe a risk management layer, a user abstraction layer, gas abstraction, cross-chain abstraction, etc., until we reach like, mass adoption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if I can chime in just on what you were talking about around how these, how we're kind of rebuilding this infrastructure layer. One thing that I noted at ETH Denver, and I wrote an article about this that we published yesterday or the day before, I forget. I noticed, kind of like you were saying, Margaux, there were a lot of teams there. It wasn't just layer twos, but it was also ostensibly competitors to Ethereum in Bitcoin, Solana, and so on. And it does feel like Ethereum, you could interpret this in two ways. One is maybe Ethereum is ceding its lead in the L1 race, in the layer one race. It's, lagging behind maybe some of these other competing platforms, data availability layers like Celestia and so on in terms of providing certain functions. But you could also look at it as Ethereum widening its umbrella, because we are reaching a reality where the apps that we're talking about are built across several different ecosystems. So I wonder, Paul, if you have any thoughts from what you saw at ETH Denver around what this means for Ethereum, which until now has by far been the strongest, largest blockchain in terms of developer ecosystem, liquidity, and so on and so forth, as far as smart contracts are concerned.
Right. So I think the very powerful thing about Ethereum in terms of community and ecosystem has been the EVM. And all the code that has been built already, especially the safe code that has been audited times and times again, that's a lot of money that has been poured into an ecosystem that sort of like strengthens the network effects of Ethereum and makes it extremely hard for teams like ours to consider like moving to Rust, for example. It should require having completely new talent base, completely new audits, etc., etc. However, this has pushed like competitors of Ethereum to take very opinionated bets to be able to challenge the current state. And I think Solana specifically had been extremely, like, to be frank, brilliant at taking those bets, whether it's like, okay, launching a phone or taking, Solana with the SVM and Rust, which are, very concentrated bets, as well as the way they're thinking about scaling and approaching the long-term vision of Solana, which is like more of this global state machine, whereas, Ethereum is more this layer 2 vision where the state is a bit, fragmented and, but, scales on top of this very unopinionated base layer. And I just feel like the competition right now is super healthy, because we kind of had the feeling, I would say like maybe a year or two ago, that the Ethereum, community was a bit relying a little bit on its previous success. While you could tell in the last 6 months that, Ethereum researchers and community is, in my opinion, I have the feeling that things are accelerating because they see that there is pressure coming from there are other opportunities out there. Solana being probably the leading one at the moment. And overall, I just feel like that's an extremely healthy competition for the space.
That is super interesting, Paul. I mean, the network effects, but that that point you made about how there is a lot of money and time that's been spent on kind of perfecting, these early movers, that it's, once those network effects are sort of established, it does seem to get much more difficult to knock them off. And you just kind of got to go with the flow if you're jumping in now. All right, let's go to the break. And then when we come back, Sam is going to lead a discussion into some of the stuff that he's been writing about and talking to Paul about, with sort of the new look of DeFi. Okay, we'll be right back. Calling all developers. Score a Consensus 2024 Developer Pass for just $109, but act fast. Only a limited number of these passes are available. You may have heard that Consensus ain't for devs, but here's why you're wrong. Consensus is the only place you can fully immerse yourself in a multi-chain environment and learn directly from 20-plus chains, including Arbitrum, Chainlink, Solana, and more. Enjoy 3 days of intensive learning with technical talks, 40-plus expert speakers, and 20-plus in-depth workshops, including dedicated half-days for Ethereum and Bitcoin, and 3 full days of programming on our Protocol Village stage. Consensus 2024 is happening May 29th through 31st in Austin, Texas. Don't miss your chance to network at curated developer meetups, find new career opportunities, and explore hundreds of side events and hacker houses around town. Grab your $109 developer pass today, but remember, this exclusive offer is limited. Visit consensus.coindesk.com now to secure your developer pass before they're gone. Explore the epicenter of blockchain innovation at Consensus 2024. And we're back with Paul Frambot of Morpho. And Sam, I'm just going to turn it over to you to lead this discussion and this portion of the show. Why don't you take it?
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. So Paul, I kind of want to just get into a discussion with all of us here about DeFi, what you're building, and what it says. You guys have a thesis about the state of DeFi and particularly risk management on DeFi that is ambitious, but also, you'll have a lot of people, I think, disagreeing with your take, and we've talked about that as well, and I want to kind of get into it. So, Paul, how about you explain to us the conventional model on in crypto? We talk about DeFi, we talk about lending. Can you briefly, if possible, just tell us how these incumbents like Aave and Compound work, how they manage people's money when they deposit into those systems?
Right. So the way we think about DeFi is that you mainly have two different kinds of protocols. You have actual protocols and you have what we call on-chain funds. And really the way to think about Aave and Compound is like
you
a very
call
large
them on-chain funds, right?
Yeah. What
Just
I
to
said
be
was
clear.
like the Morpho.
Okay.
Yeah. The Morpho, the Morpho team.
Gotcha.
And
All right.
On-chain funds are essentially large pools of capital that are managed, right? And managed in a decentralized way. So in the case of Compound and Aave, essentially you have one pool of capital where everybody is going to deposit their money and it's going to be super passive for users, right? They don't get to do risk management themselves. They don't get to care about user experience. It's a very flexible and convenient way of lending and borrowing, right? And essentially this requires management in the background to make sure that the money is not going to be lost, that the interests that are generated come from proper collateral, that the collateral is safe, that the code is safe, etc. And so this management in the background is handled the following way. Essentially, the Aave DAO, so token holders, are voting, and Compound DAO as well, are voting to basically list new collateral, adding, maybe BTC as collateral or MKR as collateral to enable borrowers to borrow money from the large pool of capital that is common and global to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, token holders have to decide on collateral liquidation parameters, collateralization factors, so like caps, borrower caps, close factors. You have a lot of those parameters. Essentially, on Aave, you have 700 of them, right? And those are fairly non-trivial to set. Should you set the WBTC liquidation LTV at 85% or 82.6? Really, it's not that trivial. There's a lot of data and simulation to be done in the background. And obviously, token holders are usually you quite passive, to be frank, and they don't necessarily are knowledgeable about risk management because it could be anyone. I could go to a DEX right now and buy Aave tokens. And so the thesis we have is that this first it does not seem right to us. And obviously, in practice, they don't know how to set those parameters. So they're going to contract with external parties that are going to tell them what's the way of doing things. And so what the Aave DAO has been doing over the last 4 years is contracting with players like Gauntlet or Chaos that are going to make proposals and are going to propose risk parameters. So, moving STs from 72 to 75.6, whatever, on a daily basis, they're going to, propose those different changes. And then every day, the token holders are going to look at the current proposals and they're going to approve it or disapprove it if they have something to say. But usually it's, 100% of the time green lighted. Very few cases was not the case for different reasons.
If I can pause here and maybe summarize what I'm hearing. So the Aave model, just at a fundamental level, is just people can take money, they can supply these pools, or they can borrow from these pools. And the Aave DAO, a bunch of Aave token holders, are tasked with managing the risk of those pools. They're tasked with voting on whether they should increase, decrease supply, borrow caps, so on and so forth. And they defer to these firms. Gauntlet, we'll talk about this no longer, but that was one of them. Chaos is another one that's still there. They defer to them on many of these decisions. They being the DAO, they ultimately vote, but they use these risk managers that they contract, that they pay to make decisions. And you think that this is, a problematic system. Can you talk about like what are the risk? I mean, maybe to frame this in the context of like events, there was this big thing that happened over the summer when we first met, Paul. I reached out to you because Curve was this like, there was this big DeFi blow up that happened, and it looked like a huge pool on Aave was at risk. It looked like they were lending out to, or they were accepting too much of a certain token for a certain kind of collateral. That's why we were talking about things. I wonder if in the context of something like that, why you think this model that we're talking about is not the right model.
Right. So maybe first, I think it's worth mentioning that those decisions that token holders have to take, well, they have no actual proof about how the risk parameters are computed, right? So Gauntlet and Chaos were paid by the Aave DAO, and in order to be able to, to charge a fee, the algorithms that they're using internally are closed source, right? So the token holder has no way of reconstructing how, the risk parameter has been decided, how it has been computed. Because if Chaos was to, or Gauntlet were to, open source their model, well, they will not be able to charge such a high fee, right? That's the sort of like the idea.
If I can just clarify, Gauntlet and Chaos, they'll make a proposal for, hey, we should do this to this limit. We should increase this cap. We should decrease this thing. And to back up their proposal, they will cite research that they've done. And you're saying that the research that they've done, the methodology that they've used is opaque. So the DAO is voting based on like how much they trust these people, not how much they trust the metrics.
To be clear, like the methodology is open, but the algorithm is closed source, right?
Can you explain to me the difference between, you said their methodology is open source, but the algorithms are closed source? Like briefly, does that just mean that we know at a high level what they're doing, but we don't know exactly how they compute these numbers?
Exactly right. Right. Because either to open source all their models, well, economically for them, it just does not make sense because, most likely this is going to give a lot of negotiation power to the Aave DAO to be able to lower the fees. Because they would, anyone could run the algorithm and don't need essentially Chaos or Gauntlet anymore because everything's open source. Essentially, we as Morpho, like to call those like on-chain funds because the protocol is managed. It's not the fact that it's closed source or it's open source or it's just the idea that inside the protocol there is this management component that's going to change the risk model. That if this management goes wrong, the instance is going to could potentially break and go bankrupt, which is not the case of Uniswap, right? There is nothing in the case of Uniswap there is no concept of management. The protocol cannot go bankrupt. It's just a pure protocol with like few lines of code that assemble like a very financial primitive, and so this is how we make the distinction, essentially, like enshrined or externalized risk management.
So what Morpho's doing is you're building lending pools just like Aave's, except you're saying that instead of a DAO managing risk, we'll have these risk curators manage the risk, where it could be a DAO, it could also just be it could be a DAO. It could also just be Gauntlet or whomever else, one of these risk stewards. So I'm curious, obviously there's a lot of advantages to that kind of a system. It takes away a lot of bloat. It can make things more efficient. We didn't get into all of the disadvantages of the Aave thing in terms of your viewpoint on how those systems work. But there's a lot of disadvantages there, and that's what you're trying to solve. But with your system, I think people will come and be like, hey, what's the point of DeFi if, and I know you'll have an answer to this, but like, what is the point of DeFi if you have a pool that is managed centrally, just like in our traditional financial ecosystem?
Right. So first, Morpho Blue is doing much less than Aave in the sense that it is just the lending and borrowing engine. So that's 600 lines of code, completely immutable, super efficient. Whereas like Aave is more 7,000 lines of code, doing risk management and training the protocol. But so what Morpho Blue is more an infrastructure protocol on top of which you could rebuild those, Aave-like instances with the Morpho Blue primitive. And so the idea is that Morpho Blue does not externalizes completely risk management and does not have any opinion on how risk management should be done, right? Maybe, risk management should be token and based and decentralized through token governance, right? That could be a way. Or maybe it should be like a completely centralized, SEC registered fund, or maybe it's a mix of both. And Morpho does not have any opinion on that, and it would just let the free market decide what users will consider the safest and the most convenient for their use case. And does not have to be one single winner, by the way. Some DAOs will have their own lending pool, and maybe they want to keep it doing the Aave way. And some others, like we're witnessing with like Gauntlet or RiskDAO or Block Analytica, are experimenting new things. They're maybe taking the path of like automation and trying to remove completely the human components, and through maybe, like more ZK-oriented technology, try to automate as much as they can. But also, you have approaches, like I think Stakehouse is doing this, and probably Block Analytica as well, where the users themselves, not the token holders, but the users themselves can veto the risk management decisions. So the design space is huge. And to be frank, I don't pretend I know what's going to be the best solution out of this. I just know that the market will eventually decide. And I think it reminds me of a tweet from Aiden from Uniswap, and the way he thinks about how to decentralize things. And he said like there are really like three different ways of doing it, and the most powerful one is code, like smart contract code. The second is incentives, and the third and last is governance, right? And so you should always favor code first, and this is what Morpho is doing, like completely immutable code. If you can't solve it through code, well, maybe the incentives is the best way of doing it. So an open marketplace is, probably better suited than one monolithic government pool. And then finally, if the decision making is too political, say for example activating a fee switch, that can't really be automated through code. It's very hard to have, a free market decide what is the fee switch of a DAO that, should be taken. And so in that case, when it's natively political, it makes sense to decentralize with a token, in my opinion.
Paul, I mean, this is so fascinating. One of the things that we focus on in this podcast is, we talk a lot about the infrastructure and the various blockchains and the race for relevance and supremacy. It's so fascinating to hear you talk about, you're really working on, the protocols atop of all of this, and just to hear how you talk about it, the 600 simple lines of code. And real quick, I think we got to wrap it up here. I feel like we could talk to you for a really long time, but, DeFi summer 2020, and then we've gone through these waves of DeFi evolution over the past few years, and now here we are in 2024. Do you have a sense in your mind of kind of when we're going to see maybe the ultimate evolution of what DeFi is going to look like? Is that going to emerge this year, or is that a few years down the road, several years down the road? I don't know. What do you think? Real quick.
All right. Yeah, so I guess, we had two problems with, the first iteration of DeFi. First iteration of DeFi breaks, and it still remains within the circle of crypto for crypto users, for high net worth individual DeFi funds, etc. If we're able to get a DeFi that is safe, truly safe, right? And I'm talking about orders of magnitude, and that is sufficiently general to tackle all kinds of use cases, not just one specific risk profile or compliance profile, but any risk, any compliance profile. Well, once we have those base layers in place, then it's just a matter of like how many builders are going to build on top. And on top of those builders, through layers of abstractions, we're going to progressively reach mass adoption. And, this I'm not able to tell when exactly will happen, but I think when you look at, Uniswap rolling Uniswap before, I think around Q3, Maker progressively deploying Maker Core this year, and Morpho going live just a few weeks ago. I think, probably end of the year will be a time where, all those different new models will start emerging, in my opinion.
So that's I think by my quick calculation, that is 5 years in crypto time.
Yeah.
If you assume that 1 year is 7 years.
Anyway, big time.
So, okay. All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much. I think we got to wrap it. We're getting a nudge from Michelle, our producer. But anyway, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been fascinating. I hope this will be the first of many conversations. Margaux and Sam, thanks. Thanks to Michelle and to our booker, Mel Montañez. And that is it for this week. Thank you for listening to the Protocol Podcast. If you have any questions about any stories or comments, please reach out to us at podcasts@coindesk.com. Subject line, The Protocol. You can listen to us weekly on CoinDesk Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Protocol, on CoinDesk.com. Thank you, and see you next week.